The context really is that there's been a lot of direction from government on both sides of the Atlantic, in the UK and the US, encouraging teachers, not just encouraging, telling teachers to use particular kinds of teaching methods, to use particular processes, particular projects, which have been experimentally tested. And the emphasis is on experimental testing, from the No Child Left Behind Act at the beginning of the 21st century in America, to various directives from government in the UK. The direction has always been about using research-based methods in teaching, and that research on which teaching methods are based should be experimental research. So the context really is that that one can see the sense in that, or the ostensible sense in that, but the history of the use of randomized control trials, experimental methods in education, isn't a good one. If one looks at the testing of very large-scale research projects in America in the 1960s and 70s, projects like Head Start and Follow Through, you find that the effect sizes that are obtained from research studies of that kind are very small. And the reason is that when you use experimental methods in social science, as distinct from experimental methods in pharmaceuticals or in plant science, which is where randomized control trials really developed and where they're used most effectively. But used in the social sciences, there are so many variables, confounding variables in any situation, that they really swamp out the effect of the variable that you're interested in. So very distinguished evaluators like Lee Crumbach in America, people like Gene Glass, big statistical evaluators, have said that we really shouldn't be using randomized control trials. And yet they've kind of, I'm not sure what the kind of discourse is that's enabled them to come back. I think, you know, they've got high face validity, and I think that's the reason why politicians and policymakers are so interested in them and why they've given them such a lot of push recently. The discourse that I've talked about, the narrative about doing randomized controlled trials, really takes a very sort of confined view of what experiment might be. It looks at experiment in the natural sciences, and it looks at experiment in pharmaceuticals, in medicine, in plant science, which is where randomized control trials are used most effectively. And it says that that kind of experiment should be the sort of the model for us in the social sciences. I think that's a very constricted review of what experiment is and should be. Experiment, when it's used in the natural sciences, when it's used almost anywhere outside the areas I've talked about, outside pharmaceuticals and plant science and medicine, natural scientists have a much broader, more eclectic, more Catholic view of what experiment might be. It's a testing of an idea under controlled conditions. And I think we should take that much more eclectic, much more Catholic view of what experiment is in social science and education. You've got interaction effects to take account of when one's using experiment in the social sciences, and I think they've been minimised. We haven't really looked at those or taken account of those interaction effects nearly strongly enough when people are encouraging the use of experimental methods. And you can't use randomized controlled trials in education and the social sciences in the same way that you use them in plant sciences and in pharmaceuticals. You can't do what are called blind and double-blind trials in pharmaceuticals when you're testing a drug, and randomized control trials are absolutely brilliant, obviously, in pharmaceuticals, and I wouldn't want to use any drug that hadn't been tested using a randomized control trial. But when you use those kinds of methods in education, you can't set up the experiment in the same way that you do in pharmaceuticals. You can't set up a blind experiment where the participants don't know which is the active ingredient, if you like. And especially you can't do a double-blind trial where neither the participants nor the researchers know which is the active ingredient. So randomized control trials in education and social science aren't the same as they are in pharmaceuticals. And I think that's a really big problem, because those knowledge effects that you get when you don't have blind or double-blind trials are very important. They're very powerful effects on the way people feel about them, and clearly placebo effects can be very important. So I suppose the sort of key message is, don't eulogize one method. Don't call it the gold standard. Don't say experimental methods are the gold standard, because research anywhere, but particularly research in the social sciences and education, depends on a matrix of different methods, different techniques being used, enabling us to see where causes are. And as I've said, we get very small effect sizes when we actually do use randomized control trials in education. And the reason for that, I think, as I've said, is those interaction effects. And the example I often use to sort of to draw an analogy is of football. You don't find football managers testing whether the 4-3-3 system of organisation for the players is better than 4-2-4 by a randomised controlled trial. And the reason is it wouldn't tell you very much. It wouldn't tell you about the use of this method on this day with these players, against those players, with these conditions. Those conditions are terribly important. Those confounding variables are terribly important and affect the way that any method, any system, whether it's in football, whether it's in chess, whether it's in teaching in the classroom, the way that those methods are applied. So, you might have project method A being used by an extrovert in this set of classrooms, and they might find it, a really good method to use, but an introvert might find it very difficult, or vice versa. The conditions are going to affect the way that things are used. So the argument I've really made is that we ought to use a far more heterogeneous set of methods for doing our research. We shouldn't hierarchize, if there is such a word, those methods. It's horses for courses. A case study might be better for this particular question. A correlative study might be better for that question. One of the big users of randomized control trials in the United States, Tom Kane, has said that nowadays, and he's used randomized controls very effectively in the past, nowadays, with the stockpiles of data that we've got, randomized control trials may be just completely redundant. We can find far cheaper and easier ways of making comparisons between this and that by using existing stockpiles of data.